Okay, we are live streaming. Hey everyone, thank you for joining us tonight at the Everett Rail Marshfield Public Library. And tonight we have John Armbruster with us. And John Armbruster remembers falling in love with the Flying Fortress airplane when he was 9 years old after reading his first grown-up book, Flying Fortress, the illustrated biography of the B-17s and the men who flew them. Today, a copy of that book sits on a shelf in John's home. Who could have guessed this World War II airplane buff would one day befriend a Flying Fortress tail gunner and write his story? The author earned a journalism degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and began his career writing environmental science stories for Earthwatch Radio, a Sea Grant University of Wisconsin. He later wrote for 2 Wisconsin newspapers covering general assignment news for La Crosse Tribune, and later writing sports stories for the Marshfield News Herald. John returned to UW-Madison and earned his secondary education degree in social studies. He later completed a master's of education degree at Viterbo University in La Crosse, Wisconsin. Since 1993, John has taught a variety of history and government courses to middle and high school students, including advanced placement courses in in American and European history. John lives on a small farm in the heart of the Driftless region in southwest Wisconsin. He has 2 sons, Matthew and Joe, and his late wife, Carmen, died in 2012. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Okay, hello. Yes, my name is John Armbruster, and I thank you for joining me for this presentation on Tailspin. I'd like to say, first of all, it is a real honor to be doing this for the Marshfield Library. I grew up in Marshfield, actually out in Chile, Wisconsin, a small town just to the west of Marshfield. I went to Marshfield schools and I worked several jobs in Marshfield, and I have been gone from Marshfield for 30 years, so it's a real honor to come home. And the story about to hear comes from southwestern Wisconsin, my home. It starts with this man, Eugene Moran. You see Eugene on the left there. That is his photo. Right before he left for war in Europe in 1943, he was home on leave. The photo you see on the right is Gene as an 86-year-old man as we began our interviews and began work on Tailspin. I had first heard of Gene's story in October of 1994 under some unusual circumstances. I was a rookie social studies teacher at North Crawford Schools. North Crawford Schools is a small K-12 building. I'd say something about the size of Pittsville or Arbondale. And I was a new teacher, and it was an in-service day, no students. And I was sitting in a windowless auditorium. I really didn't know many people. So during break time, when everyone else is talking and getting coffee, I stayed put and just took in the surroundings around me, not feeling like making small talk with anyone. But there were 2 teachers in front of me, and they began talking about a man from Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, which is where my school district was then, about a man who fell from the air. I leaned forward. I wasn't quite sure I was hearing their story correctly. And when I leaned forward, I heard this story that I will now show you in a video presentation. When I had heard this story that a man had fallen 4 miles from a split airplane and lived to tell the tale, I couldn't believe it. However, the daughter of that man was a fellow teacher, and her classroom was right next to mine. And later that day, I burst into her room and said, "Oh my God, is this your dad?" And she acknowledged that. So I, as a young history teacher, became very excited and said, "Oh, well, we've got to have him come in and do lesson plans and interview him and have student projects and have him talk to the whole school." And the teacher, who was an art teacher, dropped her ream of construction paper as she was setting up class for the next day and glared at me and said, "We don't go there." I felt badly. I knew many veterans don't give up their war stories. Not only that, this art teacher was a recent widow. Her husband was a combat veteran of Vietnam, and he had recently died of a heart attack. And I sank into silence, embarrassed by my enthusiasm and insensitivity. And she said, "It's okay. We just don't talk about it." A few days later, Joni came back to my room and she handed me this newspaper article. And she said, "There you go. That is all my brothers and sisters know about my dad and his story. If you learn anything more about it, you'll know more than we do." And this is a La Crosse Tribune article from 1992. In La Crosse, Wisconsin, at the airport, they had a small air show and they flew in a vintage Flying Fortress plane, the same plane that Gene was on in World War II. And unbeknownst to anyone, any of the media up there, Gene went up there just to take a look at a replica of his old plane. And a reporter caught wind of his story and who was there, and he agreed to take one picture and answer a couple of questions. There's not a lot here. Gene's answers are very short, and that is all that we had. But I did not go there, as Joni suggested. Now, Gene was famous before. These are 3 articles from newspapers around the country in 1944, while Gene was a prisoner of war in the eastern part of Europe. Gene did not know that his story had gotten leaked to the United States. The Associated Press picked it up via an eyewitness to his story. And Gene had already had some press. When he came home from the war, the Wisconsin State Journal did interview him. He agreed to that, but then he went silent for 60 plus years. That was until 2007. Congressman Ron Kind of the 3rd District of Wisconsin, it's where I live, and Ron Kind is still the congressman, he is retiring this year, has something called the Veterans Oral History Project, in which he did live interviews with veterans, and he arranged a day, kind of a Gene Moran day at the La Crosse airport. I remember Gene's daughter, Joni, calling me up excitedly and said, "Oh my God, John, you get your family, pile in the kids, and get up to La Crosse. My dad's going to talk. He's going to talk to Congressman Ron Kind." So I did go to this interview with my wife and 2 sons. And to be honest, the interview didn't go that well. Gene only spoke for about 20 minutes. Many times his answers were short, cryptic, and then he actually stopped the interview prematurely. I actually spoke to Ron Kind recently at my book launch in April, and he remembered how difficult that interview was. But then Gene went outside onto the tarmac and snapped this picture with my 2 sons. And Gene would get onto this airplane and they would give him a 20-minute ride around La Crosse. When he got off of the airplane, reporters went up to him and asked him about the plane ride. And Gene said, "That is the last time. I did it for my buddies, but that's the last time I'm ever going to do that." And at the time, I don't think he was just talking about a plane ride. I thought, this is a story that's probably going to go to the grave. But myself, some of Gene's friends, some of his buddies from the American Legion were pushing Gene, telling him to share his story and get it in a book before he took it to the grave. Now, my connection to Gene, not only through his daughter, but Gene's wife died in 2003, and Gene became a staple at our house at my son's birthday parties and first communions. Both my father and my late wife's father died early, so Gene was like a surrogate grandfather to my son. So we grew close, but I knew to never talk about the war. Hunting, fishing, packer gangs, yes, but not the war. But I was pushing the family to try to get their dad to talk to someone, talk to an author. When eventually in 2010, Gene's daughter, Joni, came up to me and said, "Well, why don't you do it?" And I laughed because the notion of me writing a book was preposterous. Yes, as you heard in my introduction, I do have a journalism degree, and I did write for 2 newspapers in Wisconsin and a program for public radio, but that had been 20 years prior. I didn't think anyone that wrote high school basketball roundups from central Wisconsin would qualified as a writer of such a story. So I refused the story first. So again, I'm really the accidental writer. I had no intention of becoming a writer or wanting to write any book. A few weeks later, Joni came back to me and said with some good news. And she said, Dad has agreed to do a book. I'm like, great. Who's your author? She said, it's going to have to be you. He said he won't do it unless I do it. So it felt like jumping off a water tower into a bucket of water. I decided to go ahead and do it. But there was one other element to this story. This was 2010. The prior 8 years, my wife had been fighting breast cancer, stage 3 breast cancer, which became stage 4 brain cancer the previous November. She had a single tumor about the size of a grape extracted from her brain in a craniotomy at Mayo Clinic in Rochester. At that time, she was in remission, and I just didn't know what to do. I was a young father with 2 sons, a wife fighting cancer, which was in remission. I didn't know what to do, so I went to this man. Some of you in central Wisconsin may recognize this man. I know many in southwestern Wisconsin do. And to be honest, I shamelessly name drop him every chance I get. His name is Ben Logan, and he wrote what I believe to be one of the most important books ever to come out of Wisconsin, The Land Remembers, a book about growing up on a dairy farm during the 1920s and 1930s, a farm and its family. The book became a bestseller, and coincidentally, Ben later bought back the farm that made him famous, and that farm was in the very school district in which I taught. Ben had come to my classes to speak to my students, and I had often taken my students to his farm, where we'd sit in the living room where you see him pictured here and ask him questions. Ben was also a World War II combat veteran, and I thought he was the perfect person to go to talk about this. When I met with Ben to discuss the idea of me doing a book, which was still a preposterous notion in my mind, Ben was in his 90s and in a nursing home. And when I spoke with him, he said, yes, Gene's story deserves a book. Ben knew Gene, he knew the basics of his story. And he told him about how to go ahead doing this, that when interviewing veterans of World War II or any war, don't start out talking about the war. Talk about growing up on the farm. Talk about baseball, which he loved. Slowly get to the war later. If you hit a nerve, if you hit a difficult topic, stop. Immediately stop. Go on to something else, back up. Good chance he might come back to it later. As Ben's giving me this advice on becoming an author to this book, I become excited, thinking perhaps I can pull this off. But I knew that Ben had his own war stories. He was a commander of a landing craft that landed at invasion beaches in Europe. If you've ever seen the opening scene to the movie Saving Private Ryan, those landing craft that would go up to beaches under combat conditions and unload men, that is what Ben did. During World War II, there was one mission Ben had to remove himself. He got very sick and landed in the hospital. That very night, a replacement officer took his crew, his 12-man crew. They went on a mission, and they were destroyed by a German mine, killing everybody. I knew this was a difficult story for Gene. And that day when I was talking with Ben, he all of a sudden reached over and grabbed my arm and said, "This might all blow up in your face." So in December of 2010, at Country Gardens in Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, I met with Gene to discuss this story. It was the first time that Gene and I had ever talked about, we're ever going to talk about the book. And let me give you a moment here. I'd like to read you a selection from it. And this is I thought, where better to meet Gene than in a Wisconsin tavern on a Friday night in a fish fry? Perhaps that would be a good place to start. Now, granted, I'd known Gene. I'd known Gene for many years at this point, and we knew each other well, but we'd never talked about the war, and that night would be the first time. I drove straight from work and parked in front of the tavern. I sat in my dark vehicle. The car thermometer registered a mere 10 degrees. The last shards of pink sky faded tonight. I hadn't eaten in hours, but I had no appetite. Of course, I'd shared meals with Jean before, but this time the stakes were so high. I stared at the red and white neon Budweiser sign in the tavern window and wrestled with my self-doubt. I'm not a writer. I spend 50 plus hours a week at my school. I have 2 growing sons. And the question that shadowed everything, as it had for 8 years, would my wife's cancer return? But if I didn't write Jean's story, who would? I headed into the tavern. The place was full. Men nursing cans of Bud Light and Coors Light sat on bar stools that ringed the oval bar. Joni and her family had already staked out a table in the rear of the dining room. Jean wore his usual bib overalls and Army Air Corps baseball cap. He sat across the table from me next to Pauline, his wife now of 2 years. As a side note, Jean's wife died in 2003, and at age 85, he remarried. Joni kept the conversation light, but I said little. The waitress jotted down our orders for beer and soda. Jean asked for a can of Blatz. The smell of fried cod and steaming baked potatoes arriving at our table helped settle my nerves a bit. It was time to talk book. I looked at Jean, swallowed a forkful of fish, and began. I was thinking about starting after Christmas on Thursdays after school for just an hour or so. Well, what do you think? Will that work? Jean kept eating, not looking up. That would be fine, John, he replied, nodding his head, eyes riveted on his fish. I'd like to get in as many interviews as we can before spring, I added. Jean knew I operated a side business to supplement my teaching income. I raised apples, cherries, and raspberries on the 5 acres at my rural home. But as soon as school is out, we can pick back up with the interviews. Jean simply nodded. I want to start talking mostly about your growing up on the farm, and we can move to the war later, I said. I hoped talk of his childhood instead of the war would put Jean at ease, but I could sense Joni was getting restless. Dad, she burst out. There's so much you haven't told anybody, she rushed on. You need to talk about your prisoner of war days and that shipwright, the ship when the Germans transferred you. We know nothing about that. Jean stopped eating and slowly set his fork down. He set both his arms on the table, looked up, sat back in his chair. I didn't like what was happening. Joni's mention of the ship had stirred something in Jean. I closed my eyes and said to myself, Jesus Christ, Joni, shut up. You're moving too fast. But she pressed on, firing questions, rapidly talking, oblivious to her father's change in mood. Jean turned toward his daughter and roared. There are some things that are never going to go into any book. Everyone at the table froze. Nearby diners stopped talking. I didn't know what to say or do. I thought about Ben Logan's warning to me. Just 5 minutes into this project, and it was already blowing up in my face. Jean, I said at last, this is your story. We don't need to do this. Jean quietly picked up his can of Blatz and took a sip. He studied me for a moment, then his face softened. John, he said, his voice quieter, if we don't do it now, it will never happen. And so it began. Began a month later at Jean's home. And I always find this ironic that, to me, one of the greatest World War II stories is going to come from a place so humble. This is Jean's retirement home. He did raise his kids in a larger home in downtown Soldiers Grove. I would walk up that ramp and sit in his kitchen at an aluminum table. And for 3 years, off and on, we worked on this story. There's so many places and so many layers of the story. It's hard for me to know when to begin, but I'll start here in November of 1943. A few weeks earlier in October, Jean had been assigned to the 8th Air Force after his training as a tail gunner on a Flying Fortress airplane, the famed 8th Air Force. So here's Jean in an iconic Air Force, in an iconic airplane, in an iconic position, tail gunner. It sounds like something out of a movie. But in 1943, that air war for the Americans was not going well. America was trying to strategically bomb Germany into submission by destroying its industrial sites and other targets. It was not going well. American bombers fell by the dozens on these raids. And when Jean first arrived in England, the odds of an American finishing their tour of duty was about 1 in 3 at that time. To finish a tour of duty, you had to do 25 of these dangerous missions and drop the bombs on the target. When Jean first arrived in England, a lucky airman who had finished his 25 and was on his way home looked at Jean and said, For most of you guys, it's not if, but when. This is Gene's airplane, the Rikki Tikki Tavi. Now, Rikki Tikki Tavi is a story, a Rudyard Kipling story, a fictional story about a mongoose in colonial England that saves a British family. And through some research by one of Gene's relatives, this relative found a picture of Gene's plane. He said, "I think this is it." And he sent me the picture. I showed the picture to Gene, and he looked at the naked woman riding the bomb and said, "Yeah, that's the dolly." I have no idea what a fictional mongoose has to do with a naked woman riding a bomb. I don't even think I want to know, so we're just going to move on. But that was Gene's airplane, the Rikki Tikki Tavi. This is Gene's crew. The quote that I have here, "Closer than brothers," is one of Gene's. It would be hard to describe how much he loved these men. And Gene is in the upper left-hand corner. A very young crew, as most of them were. Gene was 19. At that time, there's another 19-year-old in this crew, a couple 20-year-olds. The pilot himself in the bottom right-hand corner was only 21 years old. All of these men were in their 20s, most of them their younger 20s. On Gene's fifth mission, he and his plane were assigned to do a raid over Bremen, Germany. Bremen, Germany was one of the most heavily defended targets in Germany. It's a city about the size of Milwaukee, and Gene said before they took off, he stepped outside his plane and he threw up behind his tail, and in hiding his nervousness from his crewmates. To bomb Bremen, Germany, everyone knew what that meant. They did drop their bombs on the target and were on their way home when suddenly they were attacked by dozens of German fighters. In the ensuing air battle, Gene's plane became shredded and the tail sections separated. Gene fell 4 miles straight to the ground. He fell so fast that he said the teeth fillings in his mouth popped out from the quick change of pressure. Blood pushed up into his eyes as the G-forces pushed blood into his eyes. He was blinded for a while. And I have some quotes here from Gene himself describing what it was like after the fall.
Were you still conscious?
Oh, yeah.
Were you stuck up there?
No. When it settled in, I caught it on the upswing. I caught the tree.
You caught the tree, yeah.
They said let in a tree. I didn't let in no tree. I let against the tree.
You laid against the tree?
Against the tree on the upswing of the...
Okay. When you were twisting and you were coming in...
Yeah, and this open part was down on the ground.
Okay, that makes sense.
And I crawled out the open part. Because then this open part dropped right down on the ground.
And then the open part kind of slid into the ground.
And I got turned around and crawled out, and by that time the Frenchmen were there.
That fast?
Yeah. Oh, hell, they were watching the whole thing.
And how quickly between the time you crawled out and the Frenchmen were there?
Well, it could have been over 5 minutes.
5 minutes, they'd been watching.
They'd been watching. They were just jabbering and going on, pointing at the sky, pointing at me, and pointing at the tail of the plane.
Well,
I never knew why we slid back that day. I'll never know to this all. I will never know.
slid back.
We were right up in formation.
Mm-hmm.
Just, of course, they were just shooting at us something terrible everywhere, but we're still up.
Oh, wait, the day you slid back, the day you got shot down?
Yeah. And we slid back, kept sliding back. And I even called and I said, "What's the matter? We're not staying up in formation. We're being pushed out." Well, I don't know what he meant by being pushed out or what. Whoever answered me, I can't remember. And boy, when we got pushed out.
Is that when the fighters all started hopping on you then? Yeah. When you guys started falling back, how many fighters were starting to hit you guys?
Well, I was shooting both waist gunners are shooting. The ball turret gunner was shooting. The top turret gun guy was shooting. And I believe the bombardier, no, he had that little gun poked out to one side. He was shooting too.
Yep. After Pee Wee hit and Orson's pushing the bombardier out, is the plane sustaining any damage at this point?
Oh, it's just getting ready.
Just
It wasn't the one that came up underneath. It was one that drifted in that came in. Oh, I could even see his scarf with his goggles.
you said you could see a scarf in his goggles.
Yeah, and he pointed down.
And you didn't know why he pointed
No,
down?
I figured he meant bail out.
Bail out. Okay.
That's what I figured he meant, but somebody cut loose up in front. Trapped, but you gotta remember, I got a bone sticking out of this arm.
Well, I didn't know. When did that happen?
Oh, that happened to the mission. See, it started here and come up here, and I got bone sticking up through
When did that happen in the mission?
on that mission.
But I mean, at what point?
Well, I don't know. I was too busy.
Which
This one here was, oh hell, it was all bleeding out through the suit.
When did you get hit? I didn't know you'd been hit before that.
Oh God, I was hit 3 or 4 times, had all these ribs broke. And then I started to crawl up to get, I had a chest suit laying right in front of the tail wheel. Yet I crawled up to get that, and all at once it just started down, and you can't move. And all at once it broke in two, and I'm looking right out into space. He said, young man, he said, you come back with any more of these forged papers, and he said, you won't need to have to worry about going into service. He said, I admire you for wanting to get into service this bad. But he said, you forged any more papers. And he said, I'll have you put where you won't need to worry about the service. So home, and I went home, and I said, well, I'm in the service now. How could you? We didn't sign for you. Well, I said, I forged your names. Well, we can get that broke. No, I said, you can't. I'm already sworn in, and I wasn't. But I said, you'd make it a lot easier for me if you would sign these papers, in case they ever come back and check on it. Well, if you're that determined to go and get yourself killed, we'll sign them. It's the most beautiful thing to go up above, get above them clouds and see the sun. Oh, wow. It looks just like a city. That is the most beautiful thing that I have ever seen in my life.
How did you check if oxygen worked? How did you check that?
You know, if you had a little hangover, you just hooked it, and you stuck that in your mouth, and then you turned the valve. And if your head cleared right up, the oxygen was working.
Oh my God.
The oxygen was working. Otherwise, we called everybody by our first first thing.
You did? Officers too?
Oh, yeah. There was no, we were a family, a tight family.
And that's what made you guys such good friends.
If they didn't live, you didn't live.
Okay.
And that is from the 28 recorded interviews that I had with Gene over a 3-year period. This here is also one of the interviews I had with Gene, but one day I went to Gene's house and said, Gene, it's time for a field trip. I want you to take me to your home farm, which is located just a few miles south of Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. I took my wife and my 2 sons, and for Gene, the barn where he hand milked cows as a child during the Depression is standing right there and still is today. You can see it in the background of the picture. The house where Gene grew up in, his along with his 5 siblings, is still there. It's now a rented place. And I got to see the land that made Gene Moran. Now, I myself grew up working on dairy farms in central Wisconsin, which was flatland, and that in itself was very difficult. Where Gene and his family farmed was all ridge and valley country. I can't imagine the difficulty of farming and the danger of farming on such hilly terrain. About a week after this photo was taken of Gene and Carmen, Carmen and I and my boys were outside doing yard work when my wife came up to me and said, something is very wrong. I had no idea. She was talking all right and standing there, but then I noticed a throbbing, pulsating sensation coming from her cheek. I sat her down and it became worse, and she began to slur her words, and I realized she was having a seizure. I called her oncologist at Mayo Clinic, and she said, get her here now. So I drove her immediately to Rochester, and we had another CT scan the next morning. And we'd been through this procedure many times. We'd have the scan in the morning and wait for the results in the afternoon. And I thought perhaps that stubborn tumor, which had come back several times and we had eradicated with surgery and laser surgery, had come back again. I thought, well, another setback, but we've taken care of it before, we will again. This time when the neurosurgeon placed the image up on a screen for us all to see, her brain lit up like a Christmas tree. There were tumors everywhere and lines of cancer throughout her brain. I looked at the surgeon and said, we really don't need you anymore, do we? And he shook his head and said, no, you don't. Carmen died 6 months later that December, just before Christmas. So the book project for Gene and me came to a halt. And I didn't know if I'd ever be able to start it up again. So I decided I needed some help. And later that spring, about 4 months after my wife died, I went to the UW-Madison's Writer Institute, where I met my editor, Heather Shoemaker, herself a very successful author. Heather took in 25 submissions that day, and she was going to choose one. I had simply written one chapter of Gene's story, and to be honest, it was a pretty rough draft. Heather decided to choose mine. We met that day and she said, what do you plan to do with the story? I said, I'm simply going to write it. The family's going to front the cost to self-publish it, and we're simply going to distribute it in Southwest Wisconsin and for family. She said, I think you could have a much bigger audience. I believe you need to go the traditional publishing route, getting an agent, getting a publisher, writing a book proposal, because she said, this is an incredible story. It could have a much larger audience. However, she warned me, good books take time. She said, this might take you 5 to 10 years, longer perhaps, now that you're a single dad and you're still working. But Gene didn't have that kind of time. That very weekend, when I met my editor, Heather, Gene had had a heart attack. Coincidentally, he was taken to the VA hospital in Madison, where I was attending that conference. The family called me and I asked to see Gene, and they said, yes, he made it. He's living. You can visit him in his hospital room. And I walk into his hospital room and I see this. Yes, Gene posing with 2 Wisconsin beauty queens, Miss Wisconsin on the left, Miss Teen Wisconsin on the right. Gene was fine. The man was twice my age and married, and he's the one with the beauty queens. So I sat down and talked with Gene. I said, well, someone would like to make your story a big deal. But she said, it's going to take 5 to 10 years to write a traditional book. Gene acknowledged what I was getting at. The man had just suffered a heart attack and he was 88 years old. I said, Gene, this is your call. And he looked at me and he said, John, if I don't read it down here, I'll read it up there. So we decided to do it. And my editor and I, what type of book to put out. At this point, many people in that generation were writing stories. And there was a very popular one just coming out called Unbroken, the story of Louis Zamperini, who had a very similar story to Gene's, a bomber plane crash, a terrible POW experience that was selling, that was a New York Times bestseller. And I kind of wanted to do something like that. My editor, though, suggested, you know, Gene Moran just seems like such a character. You heard the audio quotes, and he was. Those interviews were very enjoyable, sometimes very emotional. She thought, could we look at a Tuesdays with Maury approach? And I'm like, well, why don't we start out each chapter with Gene as an old man and then morph into the war story? We agreed. The next point we did not agree on. As we start working on putting the blueprint together for the book, she said, wait a minute, your wife died in the middle of this? I said, yes. Well, she said, as a reader, if you're going to insert Gene as an old man and you as the author character, I need to know that. I'm like, no, you don't. I said, I lived it. I'm not going to write it. Long story short, I agreed with her. And so you can kind of add in a Steel Magnolias aspect with this book. This was a very unusual format for a World War II book. I thought people might pick up the book expecting only a World War II story, might be disappointed, or they might be picking up a cancer story and get a history lesson. And I told Heather, I said, this is either going to flop or maybe be a big deal. So far, reviews have been outstanding and sales have been going very well this summer. I risk being immodest here by showing you this, this review from the Midwest Book Review. But the words that jumped out at me, and I have two of the words highlighted, one more, but the word relationship. Someone said, this isn't a war story. This is a relationship story about friendship and connection. And my publisher made a video describing those themes that I would like to end with today. And those are the characters of Tailspin that you just witnessed. I end on this slide right here, the main two characters. And believe me, they're both characters, myself and Gene. It was interesting that as we're putting the book together, there are many photos in the book, pictures of Gene and my sons, pictures of Gene and my wife, and certainly his beloved crewmates. The editor said, okay, now I need a picture of you and Gene. And strangely, all those years together, no one ever took a picture of us. So there is no picture of Gene and me. However, as a gift for completing the book, someone had a painting done of us. And that's where it ends. I want to thank you very much for joining me for this presentation. And hope you enjoy my book, Tailspin. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. It is not fair how much that made me cry.
You know, it's funny. That's not my intention. I don't mean to be Mr. Drama.
No.
But I know there's a lot of emotion in the story, and that video that my publisher made really gets you.
Oh, it does, yeah. It's a laugh through the tears sometimes.
Yes, yes.
Goodness.
There's a lot of humor in the book too. So
yeah,
I hope people enjoy that. So, all right, I'm going to close out shop here, and then I'm going to walk over to the community center and see what's up.
Thank you so much.
You bet, Maida.